The storm had rolled in without warning, swallowing the quiet town beneath a sky of bruised clouds and restless wind. At the edge of Maple Creek Road, a single porch light flickered against the rain, casting long shadows across the Bennett family farmhouse. Inside, the clock struck 9:47, and in that moment, between the thunder and the silence, a truth buried for 15 years began to stir. Evelyn Bennett sat alone in the den, clutching a faded photograph of her two sons, Daniel and Mark. The picture was taken in 2007, the summer before everything went wrong. Daniel, the older one, stood straight, his arms slung protectively around Mark's shoulder. Mark was smiling then, the kind of carefree grin that came before adulthood, before regret. The photograph had yellowed with time, but Evelyn kept it framed, untouched. Because even after all the years, she believed in the same lie everyone else did, that Daniel's death was an accident and that Mark had nothing to do with it. But that night, the phone rang. The voice on the other end was trembling, hollow, barely human. It was Mark, and what he said next would unravel everything she thought she knew. "Mom, I can't do this anymore." Before we go deeper into this chilling case, I'd love to know, where are you watching from tonight? Drop your city or country in the comments. And as the details unfold, tell us, do you believe this was an act of greed, betrayal, or something darker? Also, if you're drawn to haunting mysteries like this one, please hit the like button and subscribe. It helps us keep these secrets exposed and bring you more stories that the world should never forget. Mark Bennett was 42 when he confessed, but his story began long before the guilt ever found him. Back in 2007, the Bennetts were considered a model American family. Daniel, the eldest, was the responsible one, a real estate agent with a reputation for honesty and charm. Mark, 5 years younger, was the opposite, restless, impulsive, always chasing shortcuts. Their father, Howard, had built his small construction business from the ground up, while their mother, Evelyn, kept the books and held the family together through discipline and quiet faith. When Howard died unexpectedly from a heart attack, the cracks began to show. The family gathered in the lawyer's office 2 weeks later, still numb from grief. Rain tapped against the windows as the will was read aloud. Howard had left the company to Daniel, with a clause granting Mark a smaller share once he proved financial stability. To Mark, it felt like a betrayal, the final judgment from a father who never believed he'd amount to anything. Witnesses later recalled seeing tension that day. A neighbor, Mrs. Reynolds, remembered Mark leaving the office pale and trembling, his car door slamming hard enough to echo down the street. Daniel had followed him outside, their voices rising above the rain. No one knew what was said, but that was the last time anyone saw Daniel alive. 2 days later, Daniel's truck was found at the bottom of a ravine off Ridgeway Pass. The official report called it an accident. The brakes had failed, the investigator said. It was tragic but not suspicious. Mark wept through the funeral, his mother clutching his hand while the casket was lowered into the ground. The town moved on, but some people whispered that Mark's grief looked rehearsed. For years, life went on. Mark sold the family home, moved 3 towns over, and started working odd jobs. He kept to himself, rarely visiting his mother. Every Christmas card he sent carried the same hollow message: "Love you always." But guilt has a way of surviving even silence. It lingers in dreams, in the spaces between ordinary moments, in the echo of a brother's name you can't say without your voice cracking. 15 years later, when Mark finally broke down, he told detectives he hadn't planned for any of it. That night in 2007, he said, Daniel came to the construction site to talk. "We argued," Mark told them in his taped confession. "I was angry. He said I was wasting my life. I told him I deserved my share. He laughed, said I'd blow it in a year. I don't remember much after that." Reports suggest the argument turned physical. Mark shoved Daniel. Daniel fell. The sound of his skull striking concrete still haunted him, Mark said. Panic took over. Instead of calling for help, he dragged Daniel's body into the truck, trying to make it look like a car accident. He rolled the vehicle toward the ravine, headlights still on, then walked back into the night with shaking hands and blood on his sleeve. For 15 years, the lie held. The official records listed Daniel's death as accidental. Insurance was paid. The company dissolved quietly, leaving no trace of suspicion. But truth doesn't decay, it waits. The first person to sense something off wasn't a detective or journalist. It was Evelyn. In 2021, she received a letter from an insurance company about a previous claim discrepancy. They were reopening several files from 2007 due to fraud suspicions. The note mentioned Daniel's policy. Evelyn called Mark that night, asking if he had any records. He froze. Something in her voice, the trembling trust, broke him open. A week later, he showed up at her doorstep in the middle of a rainstorm, much like the one years ago. His clothes were soaked, his eyes hollow. He didn't say a word at first. Then, without prompting, he whispered, "Mom, I did it. I killed Daniel." Evelyn thought it was delirium, exhaustion. She told him to sit, to calm down on, but Mark only repeated the words louder, his voice cracking with the weight of years. "He wasn't supposed to die. I just wanted him to listen." The next morning, Evelyn called the police. Within hours, detectives reopened the case that had been closed for nearly 2 decades. Detective Laura Finch, who led the investigation, said later that the confession alone wasn't enough. "We've had false confessions before," she told reporters. But something about this case felt different. His details were too specific. The placement of the wounds, the damage pattern on the truck, things no one outside forensics ever knew. Forensic re-examination confirmed the truck's brake lines had not failed, as once reported. Instead, Daniel's skull fracture showed a distinct pattern inconsistent with a crash. He had been dead before the vehicle went over the edge. The medical examiner's revised report listed the cause of death as blunt force trauma. The accident had been staged. What Mark didn't know was that his brother's watch had been found inside the truck, the glass cracked, the hands frozen at 10:23 p.m. Investigators had always assumed it stopped during the crash. But the timeline Mark gave in his confession matched that exact time, the moment Daniel fell. That coincidence sealed his fate. Mark's arrest shook the small community. Neighbors who once pitied him now struggled to reconcile the man they knew with the truth he'd buried. One local pastor recalled Mark attending church every Sunday for years, sitting in the same pew, singing the same hymns. "He looked like a man trying to believe in forgiveness," the pastor said. In court, Mark refused to take the stand. His public defender entered a plea of guilty to manslaughter, though prosecutors pushed for second-degree murder. The trial was short, quiet, and devastating. Evelyn attended every session, never once looking away from her son. When the verdict was read, guilty, she closed her eyes and whispered something no one could hear. After the sentencing, Detective Finch visited Evelyn at her home. "Do you hate him?" she asked gently. Evelyn shook her head. "No," she said. "I just wish I'd seen it sooner. Maybe then both my sons would still be here." But the story didn't end in the courtroom. 2 months after Mark's imprisonment, investigators found something that deepened the mystery even further. A set of unsigned letters hidden in Daniel's old storage locker, written in his handwriting but never mailed. One of them was addressed to their father, another to Mark. The letters revealed that Daniel had been planning to sell the company and split the profits equally with his brother. He had even written, "I want to make things right. Mark deserves another chance." No one knows if Daniel intended to tell him that night at the construction site. And by the time those letters were exposed, it was far too late. The discovery of Daniel's letters changed everything. For weeks after the trial, Detective Finch couldn't shake the feeling that this case had one final layer left unturned. If Daniel truly meant to reconcile with his brother that night, then the tragedy wasn't born from hatred. It was born from misunderstanding, a single moment of anger that spiraled into a lifetime of silence. The letters were kept sealed until the court approved their release. When Evelyn finally opened them, her hands trembled. The paper had yellowed with age, the ink slightly faded. Daniel's handwriting was neat, deliberate, just as she remembered it. The first letter was addressed to Howard, their late father. In it, Daniel wrote about his regrets, how he felt pressured to be the responsible one, how he resented being compared to Mark, and how he wished their father could see that Mark was trying. The second letter was harder to read. It was meant for Mark. "Little brother," it began, "I know things have been tense between us. I don't blame you for being angry. I've been angry too, but I've been thinking a lot about Dad, and I think he'd want us to stop fighting over what's left. None of this is worth losing family over. I want to sell the company, pay off the debts, and start fresh, together. Call me when you're ready." The letter was dated the day before Daniel died. When Evelyn read it aloud during her private meeting with Detective Finch, there was only silence afterward, an unbearable kind of silence, the kind that hangs between grief and revelation. The truth had been exposed, but it offered no comfort. It only deepened the wound. In the weeks that followed, news of the case spread through the town like wildfire. Local headlines called it the Bennett confession. National outlets briefly picked it up. Brothers' alibi shattered after 15 years. For a moment, everyone was talking about guilt, forgiveness, and the dark corners of family loyalty. But once the cameras left, the real aftermath began. Evelyn stopped answering her phone. The farmhouse grew quiet, curtains drawn, lights rarely on. She'd lost both sons, one to death, the other to guilt, and the silence of that house became a kind of tomb. She began writing letters of her own, each one addressed to Mark in prison. None of them were angry. They were filled with memories, childhood moments, birthdays, the smell of her late husband's workshop, the way Daniel used to hum while fixing things around the house. She ended each letter with the same line: "You were both my boys. That will never change." In prison, Mark read every one of them. Guards said he never spoke much, but on visiting days, he'd ask if his mother was okay, if she was eating, if she still went to church. "I didn't mean for any of this," he told a prison chaplain once. "I just wanted to be seen." The chaplain later described him as a man haunted more by what he didn't say than by what he did. Meanwhile, Detective Finch continued piecing together the final details. She reviewed every photograph, every report, every statement from 2007. And one detail kept nagging at her: the original brake line report. The technician who signed it had died years ago, but Finch found his assistant, now retired, living in Oregon. During a phone call, he hesitated before admitting something he'd never told anyone. "The sheriff back then said not to dig too deep," he confessed. "Said it was an accident and the family had been through enough. So I wrote what he wanted." It was confirmation of what Finch already suspected. Someone had intentionally closed the case early to avoid scandal. The Bennetts were respected in the community, and Daniel's death had been easier to bury as an accident. The truth had been ignored, not because it was invisible, but because it was inconvenient. That revelation haunted Finch. She filed an internal report, but it was too late to hold anyone accountable. The sheriff had passed away years earlier. All that remained was the quiet acknowledgement that justice, once delayed, had been willingly silenced. Months turned into years. Mark remained in prison, serving his sentence quietly. But something shifted in 2023. Evelyn passed away in her sleep. Peacefully, the doctor said. On her bedside table, police found an envelope labeled simply, "For Mark." Inside was Daniel's letter, the original copy, and a note from her: "Tell the truth, live in it, and forgive yourself. Love, Mom." When Mark received the envelope, he didn't speak for a long time. Then he requested to see the prison chaplain again. According to the chaplain's notes, Mark said, "I used to think confession was punishment, but maybe it's the only thing keeping me human." He began attending counseling sessions, talking openly about guilt, the night of the argument, and the years of silence that followed. For the first time, he described what happened after Daniel fell. "He was still breathing," Mark said quietly. "I panicked. I thought if I called 911, they'd think I did it on purpose. I told myself he was already gone. That lie saved me that night, but it killed everything else." The more he talked, the more details emerged. Investigators later confirmed that Daniel's pulse might have still been detectable for several minutes after the fall. Had Mark called for help, Daniel might have survived. That single decision, the one driven by fear, was the true crime beneath the confession. In Twer, after serving nearly 2 decades including pretrial time, Mark became eligible for parole. The hearing drew quiet attention from local media. There were no angry protests, no crowds demanding his release, just a few reporters, a prosecutor, and the quiet hum of fluorescent lights. When asked if he had anything to say, Mark stood slowly, his voice steady but worn. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said. "I've lived 15 years pretending to be innocent and another 7 trying to understand what that lie cost. I took my brother's life, my mother's peace, and my own soul. I've got nothing left to protect. Only the truth." The board deliberated for 40 minutes. In the end, parole was granted. Mark Bennett was released under strict supervision with a condition to complete community service and therapy. He left prison a thin, graying man. No one waited for him outside, no family, no press, just the cold wind of late autumn and a sky that looked ready to rain. He rented a small room behind a church in a nearby town and began volunteering with a local outreach group that helped families affected by violent loss. The irony wasn't lost on him. Detective Finch visited him once. "Do you ever think about that night?" she asked. "Every night," he said, "but not just the part you think. I think about what he might have said if I just listened." For her, the case had become more than a job. It was a reminder of how truth often hides in plain sight, buried under fear and family loyalty. She filed her final report under the heading, Closed. Confession verified. But the last sentence she wrote read simply, Justice incomplete. Years later, Mark visited the ravine where Daniel's truck had been found. The area had changed. The road widened, guardrails installed, the trees taller. But he recognized the place immediately. He stood there for hours, the sound of wind filling the silence, before leaving a small wooden cross with two names carved into it, Daniel and Mark Bennett. As he walked back toward the road, a light drizzle began to fall. In that moment, it was hard to tell if he was seeking forgiveness or surrender. The story of the Bennett brothers became a local legend, a cautionary tale about pride, silence, and the cost of truth. But for those who lived it, it wasn't a story. It was a wound that never fully healed. Detective Finch retired the following year. On her last day, she placed a copy of the case file on her desk and whispered, Every family has secrets. Some just refuse to stay buried. Sometimes, the darkest confessions don't come from strangers or killers in the shadows. They come from the people who once promised to protect us. And when those truths are finally exposed, they leave behind echoes that never fade. The Bennett case remains one of the most haunting examples of how guilt and love can coexist, how a lie told in fear can destroy generations. Evelyn's last wish was for both her sons to find peace. Whether they ever did, no one can truly say. Sometimes the darkest secrets are the ones we keep from the people we love. And in this case, the truth was exposed, but the damage was already done. Do you think justice was truly served? Or are there still secrets left buried? Share your theories in the comments below. And if you want us to continue exposing the world's darkest family secrets and betrayals, hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next story we bring to light.